All right, well, welcome everyone to our session. We're going to go ahead and get started. So this is Making Co-Management Work, Case Studies from Maine's River Herring and Shellfish Fisheries. So just to give you a little bit of what the format is going to be, we'll have 4 presenters. Each is going to talk for about 8-ish minutes. We'll take a couple of questions after each presentation if there are any. And then I'm hoping we can leave about half the time at the end to have a discussion. I have a couple questions for the folks that are presenting, but I hope others do. And then I'd love to hear from anyone that's in the room about kind of examples of co-management and what that looks like in the fisheries that you're all involved in. So hopefully be thinking about that. So just to briefly introduce the topic and the presenters, they're all going to talk about fisheries collaborative management or co-management, which I think everyone is fairly familiar with. Oh, hi, Bailey. Glad you made it on. But really a governance structure where resource users and governments are sharing responsibility and power to manage a fishery across a continuum. It can look a lot of different ways. We're going to hear first from Josh Stoll at the University of Maine about what co-management looks like and sort of how it might vary across the spectrum of shared responsibility and power. We're then going to hear from Marissa McMahon at Maine, who is going to talk about co-management in the wild shellfish fishery in Maine. Then we'll hear from Mike Talhauser at Maine Center for Coastal Fisheries, who's going to talk about co-management in the river herring fishery in Maine. And then finally, we'll hear from Bailey Bowden, who is a harvester of both river herring and shellfish. And if I'm not mistaken, Bailey also the chair of both the river herring, or the Elway Committee and the Shellfish Conservation Committee in the town of Penobscot. So he'll talk about his perspective participating in co-management in both of those fisheries. I should have introduced myself. I'm Emily Farr, also with Manamet, like Marissa, in Maine. So I will, with that, turn it over to Josh. And just before I do, note that Josh is actually double booked right now. So if you have questions for him, ask them after his presentation, and then he's going to have to bounce over to another session. So
it's not my fault. Thank you, and it's nice to see all of you. My name is Josh Stoll, and I'm assistant professor in the School of Marine Sciences. I will remind anyone who's on their cell phone that they can turn it off or maybe leave the room. And just a thought there. I have the pleasure of being part of this panel on co-management in Maine, and really the meat of this set of presentations is the speakers who are going to be coming next. But I want to tee things up by the focus of this is about making co-management work, and tee it up with this question of why. So we've talked a lot about co-management in the last day and a half, and I think all of us come from different perspectives and have different connections to co-management. And to kick things off, I want to draw on a mini case study that is not related to fisheries, but is related to Maine, and is personally related to my own experience living and working in Maine.
Hey Josh, do you want to just back up like 3 feet? So
okay.
You're seeing your midriff on the Zoom. So.
Sorry. Okay. I can't see myself.
I know.
And so this is a story about wiffle ball. Who here plays wiffle ball, knows wiffle balls? It's a plastic ball that you hit with a yellow stick. And from the time that I was 5 years old till my mid-20s, growing up in Eastern Maine, I played wiffle ball almost religiously with a set of friends in behind their house and nestled between their house, the back of their house, and a chicken coop. And we played for more than 2 decades. And in 2003, probably the biggest achievement of my life happened. A reporter showed up, and they wrote in the Ellsworth American, which is this newspaper, local newspaper, and wrote a 2-page story about our wiffle ball experience. And reflecting on that, this was sort of a core part of our experience growing up. And the article ended up being about the rules that we created to play the game of wiffle ball between a chicken coop in the back of our house. And really, at the end of the day, and reflecting on that a decade later, these rules were all about how do we simultaneously, there's three of us, how do we simultaneously allow ourselves to play as hard as we possibly can and create a game where no one ever loses. And the reason for that was, especially when we were in our teens, if one of us lost, we'd get angry, and that would often lead to fighting and sometimes physical violence. And so we invented this really complex set of rules about how do you play wiffle ball, get your energy out, and at the end of the day, keep the peace. And of course, there's a more formal way to think about this besides sort of a game of wiffle ball. These are called rules in use. And they're a core part of co-governance. And McGinnis and Ostrom and many other people have developed a set of concepts related to the governance system. How do we govern, whether it's a wiffle ball game or a natural resource, how do we govern a system? And rules in use are a core piece of that, as well as things like geographic scale, the population, the historical context and the continuity. But all of these are really important to co-governance. And so in a place like Maine, where fisheries are really important, we have all kinds of different actors contributing to that rulemaking, that rules in use process. And that extends from the uplands, so the inland, the upland zone, all the way through the coastal zone, the intertidal zone, the inshore zone, the offshore zone. And we have this whole range of different characters and players who participate in that coming together of the co-development of rules and regulations for fisheries. And so an example of this is the Maine Department of Ag that is involved in primarily the upland zone, but some of the coastal zone. And of course, in association with that, or in addition to that, you have this slew of characters and this slew of formal actors that are engaged in this rulemaking process to manage our natural resources. In addition to these different agencies, you have sovereign tribal nations. You also have the US and Canada. Maine's a boundary state. And many of these are formal authorities, but you also have informal actors as well that contribute to that rulemaking process. You have overlapping jurisdictions. So you can see from this figure here, you have a number of different people in both the marine space and the terrestrial space, and some that cross over. And each one of these agencies, they have their own directives. Sometimes they're in line, sometimes they're slightly in line, and sometimes they're in opposition. And you result in this essentially this complex jigsaw puzzle of different rules and regulations that inform and shape how we govern and how we manage our resources in a co-management sense. And of course, this is just some of those boundaries, spatial boundaries that dictate how we regulate. Now, this is a presentation. This is a slide that I stole from a colleague, Cora Johnson, and some of her students. And I really like this. This is about the closures for soft shell clams in our intertidal zones. You'll hear more about that in a presentation in a minute. But this to me really speaks to the importance of co-management, the importance of engaging different stakeholders in the process of developing rules and regulations. And this is some research they did where they asked different segments of the population to reflect on how well they understand the closed areas for shellfish. And this is when it's safe to harvest and when it's not safe to harvest. And what really speaks to me here is that sort of bottom row, whether you're a professional harvester, you're a professional farmer, so you're growing clams, or you're engaged in subsistence or recreational harvesting, or just simply a local member of the community, the extent to which people understand these rules is pretty low. Less than half, in some cases, less than half, or just above 50%. And I share this with you in reflecting on the importance of co-management and bringing it back to sort of this experience playing wiffle ball and co-designing rules and regulations that fit the local context is so critical to doing management right. And so today in this session, we're going to be talking about the alewife fishery and co-management, the alewife fishery and the softshell clam fishery. And you're going to be hearing from two people who are, actually three people, sorry, that are deeply engaged in this work in Maine. And you're going to be hearing about sort of the tussle to get it right. In some cases, you're going to be hearing about examples where it's working really well. And some places you're going to hear about where it's a struggle and where those rules in use are still being co-developed. So I'm going to pass it back to Emily, and I apologize for having to slip out to another session, but thank you.
Before Josh does slip out, does anyone have any questions for him in the room? And then I'll see if there are any.
Mine's maybe not so much cool, and maybe it's something just to think about, and then we can kind of review it again at the end. But I mean, I think there's a bit of a distinction between co-management and then co-science. And I'm interested in hearing the link between those two, and either like enabling or hindering factors and allowing those two things to happen and then feed into one another. So
Yeah, I would just quickly respond. First of all, I think that's such an important distinction between the two. And I think one of the interesting things about state-managed fisheries in the US is that they don't have the same science-based mandate that the federal fisheries in the US has. And in some cases, you might say, well, that's problematic. We want it to be science, quote unquote, science-based. But I think in a place like Maine, it's actually given the state and coastal stakeholders more capacity and more flexibility. And you may get some different perspectives on that from this group, but I think there is something to be said about that flexibility created. It doesn't just need to be science. It's a really good question.
Any other questions for Josh? All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. So I am going to now turn it over to Marissa to talk about. Am I right that Marissa's going second? Okay.
I think so.
The softshell clam fishery. So let's see. All right, and Marissa, just let me know when you want me to advance your slides.
Perfect. Thank you. Hi, everyone. And thanks, Emily, for being in control of the slideshow. I'm sorry to not be there in person with you all, but glad that I still have an opportunity to talk about Maine's shellfish co-management system. And it's probably a good thing that I'm not in the room with you because I'm fighting off a cold right now. So I also apologize in advance for any sneezing or sniffling that may occur during this presentation. But anyways, Emily, actually, I think you want to advance to the next slide. I was going to start this talk really broadly with just sort of an overview of the importance of shellfish. So the shellfish in what we now know as Maine have been harvested for thousands of years. Wabanaki people have relied on and stewarded shellfish fisheries and intertidal fisheries as part of sustenance fishing livelihoods and as really an integral part of their cultural identity. So this image is of the whaleback shell midden and is a great example of how important shellfish are to Wabanakis. This midden was actually once 30 feet deep and covered several acres. So needless to say, just, clear evidence of sort of the massive amount of shellfish that were harvested over many hundreds and thousands of years. And Emily, if you just advance, I think the next picture, and then maybe one more. There's one more picture. Okay, perfect. Thank you. So the other thing I want to point out is that settler communities have also relied on intertidal shellfish fisheries, both historically and in the present. And today, the shellfish fishery is one of the few remaining fisheries that has a fairly low barrier to entry for settler communities. You don't need a huge investment in buying a license or a boat. Many clam harvesters have been doing this for their entire lives. This is something that they grew up doing, and it's really central to their identities and connections to place. Next slide. So now if we look at this through an economic lens, the softshell clam fishery in Maine is generally the second most valuable fishery in the state from year to year. So in 2021, the fishery generated 25 million in value for harvesters. And that number doesn't include all of the additional economic activity that stems from the fishery, which is, several times more that number. And you can also see from this pie chart that clearly the lobster fishery really dominates in Maine. But again, the softshell clam fishery and shellfish fisheries in general are incredibly important. And again, have that lower barrier to entry that supports hundreds of livelihoods up and down the coast. Next slide. So the current shellfish co-management system has been in place since 1977, actually. And it consists of a partnership between 74 municipalities in Maine that have a shellfish ordinance and the state of Maine's Department of Marine Resources. And each of these institutions has different but complementary powers. And then an additional entity here is the Shellfish Advisory Council, which is a group of diverse participants within the shellfish fishery that advises the Department of Marine Resources and the legislature on relevant issues. So this is just sort of a schematic here of the system, but I'll now briefly walk through sort of each of these different entities. So first is municipal management. Municipalities that have a shellfish ordinance typically form a shellfish committee made up of volunteers who may be harvesters or other community members. And this committee is responsible for the areas outlined in the gray box. And these include things like regulating where shellfish can be taken from, protecting shellfish from predators, establishing size limits, making licensing decisions, and providing enforcement. Next slide. So now the state management side, broadly, the Department of Marine Resources is tasked with protecting shellfish resources and access to them. And they do this through providing guidance and ultimately approving municipal ordinances and licensing decisions. They also determine the minimum size regulations for clams, although towns can then enact stricter regulations on top of that if they wish. And they train and certify the wardens, shellfish wardens, who are enforcing state and municipal regulations. What's not listed here, but is also within the purview of state management, is monitoring for water quality and shellfish toxin levels for public health concerns. So Josh was mentioning that earlier in his talk. So that's a whole other sort of part of what the state is responsible for in terms of shellfish co-management. So then finally, the Shellfish Advisory Council. This council is composed primarily of members from the shellfish industry and tasked with making recommendations to the Department of Marine Resources and state legislature, as I mentioned before. And beyond that, this group sort of serves as an in-between entity for municipal and state bodies. Okay, next slide. I also want to point out that emergent networks are really important to this co-management system. So several examples of those networks are shown here. These are networks and organizations that support co-management by regularly interfacing with municipal and state managers, conducting research, developing policy recommendations, convening stakeholders, just generally sharing information. And broadly, they're really focused on supporting adaptation within the industry and also adaptive governance. And this is incredibly important given that both municipalities and state managers are very limited in capacity. So I'll give one example of this type of work. Recently, a partnership between Manomet and the Maine Shellfish Learning Network explored some of the barriers towns were facing when trying to grow shellfish to reseed their flats. So this is a form of stock enhancement that is becoming more widely used by municipalities. And the big issue here is how the state regulates the activity. So it's regulated as aquaculture, and then the subsequent permitting process, because it's regulated as aquaculture, is a huge burden and a real challenge for municipal shellfish managers to go through that process. So we worked with towns to understand the issues that they had with this process, and we worked with the state to understand the regulatory framework and what might be changed. And then we developed and helped to implement some regulatory changes to reduce some of the burden of undertaking these stock enhancement activities. And we also developed a handbook for towns to use in navigating this process. So next slide. So I do want to turn our attention to some of the issues facing the industry today, which there are many. Some of these issues include access to the intertidal being lost due to property changing hands and increasing gentrification along the coast of Maine. Access to licenses to harvest shellfish is becoming an issue, in particular for those who currently hold licenses but can no longer afford to live in the town where their license is issued. So there's a residency requirement attached to holding a commercial shellfish license. And there has long been an issue of access for Wabanaki people who are denied access to harvest shellfish on their traditional homelands. Beyond access, climate change impacts are devastating some parts of the fishery, in particular warming water, which is leading to greater predation by invasive green crabs. Water quality and harmful algal blooms are issues facing the industry, and this is exacerbated really by increasing intensity and frequency of rainfall events. And then, sort of overarching, overshadowing all of this is just economic uncertainty, which is very much linked to all of these other things that I've just mentioned, but then is also exacerbated by supply chain issues, which has really become evident during the global pandemic. Next slide. So, despite all of these many issues that I've just listed off here, the fishery is adapting, and in many ways, this is due to the co-management structure. This local control allows the fishery to respond and succeed. For example, it really facilitates community stewardship and leadership and locally relevant solutions, but it also leads to learning across towns. So what one town tries as an adaptation strategy is an example for other towns to then use. And there's been a great deal of community-led restoration work that I think is also linked to that local control and local investment to ensure a sustainable clam fishery into the future. So some towns are planting seed or adult clams in their mudflats to enhance the wild stock. Many are doing volunteer monitoring of their flats to make decisions about which ones to close as seed banks for conservation and which ones to open for harvest. Others are experimenting with different methods to enhance spat settlement on the flats. Still others are installing nets to protect certain areas from green crab predation. And all of this work is community-led and community-driven by the harvesters and supported by this co-management framework. Next slide. Of course, the shellfish co-management system is not perfect, and it doesn't always work. And it really specifically doesn't always work for everyone. In particular, as I mentioned before, the current co-management system excludes Wabanaki people from harvesting in their traditional homelands. But I think it's also important to point out that this is an ongoing process, and there's continued effort to figure out ways to improve it. For instance, the Department of Marine Resources recently hosted a series of listening sessions where municipal managers and harvesters could share what is and isn't working about co-management and potential ways that it could be improved. So these bullet points listed here highlight some of the key takeaways from these meetings, a few that I've mentioned before, and others that included increased funding and capacity at the state level to help with things like monitoring data that can then be included in decision-making, improved communication, et cetera. And you'll hear more from Bailey Bowden on some of these issues and potential changes that might work, or might make the system work a little bit better in just a bit. So next slide. So just to wrap this up, I want to end by saying, despite being based on a structure developed in 1977, I do think that the shellfish co-management system in Maine is still relevant today, maybe more relevant than ever. I think the problems facing the shellfish industry are monumental, things like climate change, and no single solution is going to work. And what works for one town might not work for another. We've actually seen this play out again and again. So it's incredibly important that the management structure allows for fine scale flexibility and more nimble adaptation strategies. Ultimately, we need decisions that are made at a relevant level. So decisions that actually match the social and ecological systems that they're impacting. And we've seen this structure lead to more local conservation and stock enhancement efforts, local leadership. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, I think the co-management structure can and has centered local knowledge, which is critical given the rate at which change is happening. Harvesters are out on the flats every day. They understand this environment and this resource better than anyone else. And without this knowledge, we don't really stand much of a chance of effectively managing or adapting this industry. So thank you so much for listening. And if we have time for questions, happy to take some.
Yeah, are there any questions in the room for Marissa? Yeah.
I'm not, plans are at 5 cards, so I.
Can you
so
hear
many-
Marissa?
Not really, but if you can repeat it, maybe.
All right, yeah, if anybody else has questions, I welcome you to ask them because I could ask a billion questions. So anyway, so okay, couple of questions.
Do you want to just come up a little closer to the microphone and then maybe it'll be easier for, I know it's not ideal, but.
Okay.
Thanks. We don't have a hand hold here.
No worries. So I guess, can you clarify if the co-management board is doing anything to increase the ability of the Wabanaki people to access their traditional lands? And then secondly, with respect to the water quality, so I saw that you had a decision tree, water quality decision tree. So are the clam flats shut down because of water quality? And if so, what does the co-management board or approach do to reopen those? And I'm curious because in Southwest, I did research down in Southwest Nova Scotia, and to reopen a closed clam beach as a result of a closure from water quality is extremely difficult. There are several departments that are involved in that process, 3 in particular. So I'm just curious, if how the co-management board addresses things like that.
Yeah, in regard to your first question, so the state at this point is not necessarily taking any tangible actions to address Wabanaki access to the shellfish resource. That's also sort of, in a complicated way tied up in a tribal sovereignty bill that has been, brought before the legislature multiple times and still hasn't passed. So there's kind of a lot tied up in that. At the municipal level, I would say we also haven't seen thus far any real examples of efforts to increase access for Wabanaki people. But I do think that there's recently been a lot of conversation around and what that might look like. So I am hopeful that we're sort of moving in a direction, if there's not going to be movement at the state level and at that sort of, top down level, I'm hopeful that at least we are seeing a little bit of movement more from the bottom up and from the community level. And then to your second question about water quality, so that water quality decision tree, so the Maine Shellfish Learning Network put together that guidance and that guidebook, and it's actually available online if you want to look for that. And it's really what it's meant to do is help towns figure out how to address their water quality issues. So if they have closed flats that they believe they could take action on to try to get reopened, that tool is meant to walk them through step by step how you would do that. And so, there's multiple different sort of tools in there, depending on what sort of, pollution or what's causing water quality issues. but really just a resource to figure out sort of, what sort of monitoring needs to happen, where there might be funding available to try to, increase capacity for that type of monitoring. And yeah, so that's where that decision tree comes into play. And I would also just quickly add, we've also seen a lot of towns sort of taking water quality into their own hands, so to speak, and wardens or marine resource officers going and getting trained so that they can actually collect water quality data, because the state is limited in their capacity and there's only so many places that they can collect data from. But if the towns can go out and expand where that data is being collected, the more data they have, the better and more fine scale those closures can be, and maybe not target these big sort of blanket areas. We've actually seen in one community in particular this year that they've reopened 4 of their flats because they've been able to go out and take, at a municipal level, take more water quality measurements and be able to actually prove that they have these flats that are able to be opened.
Bailey, why don't you jump in with one comment and then we'll return to this discussion after you and Mike have more of a chance to talk about stuff. But yeah, go ahead.
Sure. Just one thing I'd like to add is if you get one elevated fecal coliform score, you are immediately shut down from harvesting clams, and you need to get usually 5 years worth of clean water quality samples to reopen that flat. So it's a pretty difficult process to reopen once something is closed.
All right. Mike's on it. Go ahead, Mike.
I'm just not unmuting myself. Thought I was on it. All right, thanks, Emily. Thanks, everybody. My name is Mike Tallhauser. I'm the Collaborative Management Specialist for the Maine Center for Coastal Fisheries, and I'm going to talk today about collaborative management in the alewife or river herring fisheries. And you can see by the first slide here, an alewife, if you don't know, is about a 12 or so inch long silvery fish. And like most 12-inch long or so silvery fish, they are prized for their use as bait or for consumption. And as most 12-inch silvery fish, not just consumption by people, but they play a really important part of the food chain, as pretty much anything that can fit them in their mouths will eat them. And so they're really important to the eastern or the Gulf of Maine and to the Atlantic coast wide. And so I'm going to talk about the collaborative management, the actual management structure about that, and then really try to dig into the local piece of that co-management that I really view as, and I think going back to the question that I think someone asked Josh about the co-science and co-management and kind of how those fit together, I think alewife are a really good example of where it's maybe not as much of a distinction, but maybe a place where the collaborative science and collaborative management really benefit each other. So if folks don't know, river herring, alewife are anadromous fish that spawn in ponds and lakes in Maine and up and down the coast. The orange section here, let me picture it all the way here, is the native range of river herring. The burgundy colors are invasive areas, but they come back to their natal streams and ponds to spawn every year. And so they're really a fish that place matters to, and that really comes into play when we talk about co-management and that local knowledge and capacity that is part of that relationship that's management. After they spawn, the juveniles and the adults leave, and the juveniles spend about a year and a half or so, or up to a year and a half in the local estuaries before spending the next 3 to 4 years of their lives swimming up and down the Atlantic coast. And it's that scale I want folks to remember when we're talking about the different levels of management, as this is a species that spends a really important part of their life in our local communities, but spends their entire lives in a much larger area. And just to give you a scale of at least state landings and local town landings, the fishery was quite large in the past. It was obviously a really important sustenance food to the Wabanaki and Passamaquoddy tribes. And because of habitat loss and because of overfishing, there was a crash in the river herring populations, and some would say a subsequent past and a lot of the things that ate those fish, but we don't have to get to that in this session. I've already heard it brought up quite a bit so far at this conference. But that kind of leads us into who's managing these fish and what those scales are and how that relationship works. So at the federal level, because of that wide range that river herring and alewife have, they're managed by the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Council. And so this is the federal government of the United States managing this fish that swims up and down our coast. And it's at this scale that we don't have a lot of capacity, but what we do have are really blunt tools to be able to manage and make some decisions. So when that crash happened in the 80s and 90s in river herring, they were able to, and correctly so, in 1995, create a moratorium on fishing and bycatch and directed fisheries for these fish, unless there was a really hard bar of sustainability involved in a specific fishery. And so coming down, and of course, each one of these states has different problems, different issues, whether they're climate change that affects different places differently, or habitat and water quality issues, or cultural values and socioeconomic values. So bringing it down to that more localized state, we're looking at the governor here of the state of Maine and the Department of Marine Resources that, just like shellfish that Marissa talked about, is responsible for managing that fishery. And basically where they're at with this is they manage this with the ASMFC through a sustainable fisheries management plan that basically allows them to be able to get out of this moratorium if they can show that a specific stock fishery is sustainably harvestable. And with the, again, limited capacity at the state, with about 5 or 6 employees that work full-time in anadromous fish, and that's with salmon too, and 3,000 miles of coast and countless alewife streams, there's really not much capacity to be able to even come close to being able to show something's sustainably harvestable. And that's really where these local towns, that's Bailey actually there in his town of Penobscot, scooping up some alewife. And really where that capacity and that local knowledge comes into play, and that necessity. I think alewife don't have the formal co-management process and advisory committees that Marissa talked about with shellfish, but it's more of a co-management out of necessity. And a lot of it has to do with the monitoring capacity there. And it's really at this level that, the gold medal kind of goes to that capacity and that understanding of these local fisheries. And we're Maine Center for Coastal Fisheries and Manomet and other folks really try to work across those boundaries and create trust and a dialogue that could be co-management. And so I'm going to try to quickly dive through the Blue Hill Peninsula, that's mid-coast Maine, and some of that capacity that's led to really their voice, I think, and others that are like them being part of that collaborative management process. And so about 6-7 years ago, pretty close to when I started, Bailey and some other folks that were really sort of taking a page from the shellfish fishery and forming alewife committees that aren't actually necessary when it comes to alewife, came together, were facilitated a little bit by my organization, really came together and put together goals that when you look at, really look like state management, federal management, and other managers' responsibilities, things like monitoring populations, restoring access, sustainability goals. And like I said earlier about a population being harvestable if you can prove it, and that being sort of a way back into a harvest, and really what I would look at as the connection between Maine communities and these fish, these commercial harvests. They've got to be able to show for 10 years, so a long data set of different metrics for each population. So being able to count fish and collect biological samples, usually through scales that tell the length, age, and sex of fish, and whether they're repeat spawners or not. And that tells a little bit more about the actual health of the run itself. And again, we're talking 10 years of data here to be able to bring back that connection to these fishing communities, connections with these local populations of river herring. And here's just really quickly, some of these data that they've collected to put it over. And if anyone spent any time in Maine, they know that these local town governments are really important. And it's it's difficult just to get people to participate in town cleanups for one day a year, let alone put the hundreds of hours into this work for a decade to be able to do that. So that'll come up again a little bit later in some of the policy work. And again, some of those other goals that these alewife committees had were around bringing fish back. So you didn't see that in there, but 2 of the 5 river herring populations in the peninsula that the towns of Brooksville, Penobscot, and Sedgwick lie in didn't have fish anymore due to fish passage issues. And so they were able to really leverage federal, state, and other money and activate local non-governmental organizations to restore fish passage. And so this is just 2 pictures of places where they restored fish passage, but actually last year was the final year of some of this work. And the Bagaduce River drainage is now the first restored entire watershed in the state of Maine to fish passage. And so it's a real big nod to that capacity. And quite honestly, they were doing it with collaborative science and using that local knowledge. There was, in one of the sites, this is just a stream profile here where you can see a couple different issues that are, I won't go into detail, but highlighted by these little red and white bars. But the one in the middle of the stream right here indicates a place where an engineer said, well, fish can't get through here. And so it was local knowledge that said, well, they used to get through here. And we remember watching them go through there. So we ended up designing a pit tag study to show that fish actually could get past there. And it was a case that not only sort of, to me, proved that local knowledge is really important, but it also saved about $250,000 of a $500,000 restoration project. And again, stocking fish you typically think of as a state obligation and responsibility. With the logistics in a place like this, where they're privately owned roads and things like that, the only real possibility was to enlist local help in actually getting fish into ponds to bring them back. And all this work really brought about collaborative questions from these folks involved in this. And I think that's where it brings in the co-science piece of it. And so Bailey's asking questions about, why is this system more productive than that one, and what begets more fish, and what's the right harvest level. And so we started working with the University of Massachusetts and others in this middle picture, we're doing some pond seining for juvenile fish to look at abundance indexes. In the right picture, we're looking at juvenile fish use of the estuary. And in the left, we're working with Ann Hayden, Emily's predecessor, to collect eDNA samples to try to be able to get at some of these metrics a little bit better. And this is a wordy slide, you don't have to look at it too close, but we talked about that connection and between the state and federal government and how they can get around and be able to harvest fish. This is just one piece that I kind of highlighted some important things of an addendum that we were able to, through conversations with harvesters, with researchers and managers, in an informal way, because those advisory committees and formal structures aren't there. We're able to sit down and put together an amendment and a pilot program that the state, in their own words, really gives a nod to, you see words in here like the responsibility lies with these towns and volunteers, and the fact that without this assistance from towns, we would not be monitoring fish at these levels. And we were able to get an addendum to our sustainable fisheries management plan that allowed for some of that connection through commercial harvest at a lower bar than 10 years, but at a more conservative level. And that happened in 2020 for the first time in Penobscot, and there's Bailey harvesting some for the fish for the first time in quite a while in Penobscot. And I don't want to make this too rosy of a picture. I think there's a lot of trust, that still needs to be gained in this relationship. But it shows what can be done. And again, I think that's the other work that really can only happen at this local level is, bringing the next generation of stewards out to these places and bringing them along as the next folks that'll be taking this baton. And I just really wanted to quickly, one I think analogous piece to the shellfish work that Marissa talked about is the networks that I think are evolving out of these relationships and hopefully these trust building exercises and this collaborative management process. And it was just that with all this collaborative research, monitoring, management that was happening, I think we were all sort of talking to different people and realizing that everyone's involved in whether this fish is responsibly managed or not, and whether it be universities or different federal and state agencies or tribes. A lot of folks were involved in this fish and its management, and unfortunately not a lot were talking together. And so we brought together in the last couple of years a river herring network that's really still budding. But this just is a quick slide of one of the meetings that we were able to have with those state, federal, tribal, and local managers and researchers, just being in a room and having those conversations and trying to see what comes out of those. And we've started to come up with some really cool collaborative research work that we're working on, and coming out with a new website. And so there's more to come on that. Hopefully folks will stay tuned. And I'll try to wrap this up to leave a little more time for questions and for Bailey to comment on this, because I think he really brings the realistic point of view from folks at this level that are participating in the co-management process. So with that, I will answer a couple of quick questions, or one or so, if anyone has any, and we can move along. Thanks.
Thanks, Mike. Any questions from anyone for Mike? I'm not seeing any.
All right.
So if there aren't any questions from Bailey or Marissa for Mike, then maybe I'll turn it over to you, Bailey.
My turn?
Yeah, go ahead.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Bailey Bowden, and I live in the town of Penobscot. I chair the Town Shellfish Conservation Committee and the Alewife Committee, and I've chaired the Shellfish Committee since 2008 and the Alewife Committee since 2015. The opinions I'm going to share are my own, and I hope they don't reflect poorly upon my co-panelists here today. This panel has explained the potential and sunnier side of co-management, but life is not all rainbows and unicorns, and I'm here to expose the reality that fishermen face every day. There are two commercial fisheries that are co-managed by the state and municipality, and those are shellfish harvesting and river herring harvesting. And co-management, in my opinion, is the way to go. Who knows what's going on in their backyard more than the people that live in that community? And we're able to be more responsive and adaptive to the needs, where if we're dealing with the state and they're the ones in control, the state offices are 100 miles from where I live. So they're not really responsive in any means. So it's really too bad that the state is not doing more to promote co-management. Today, the spirit of co-management is continually under assault from the Department of Marine Resources. The authority of the municipality is constantly being weakened or taken away. It takes two to dance, and if your partner doesn't want to dance, you don't get very far. And that's really where we seem to be today. There are two real issues that we face, in my opinion. One is poor policy making, and the other is poor management, or the lack of management, coming out of the Department of Marine Resources. One way policy is affecting our wild fisheries is that our government is just promoting aquaculture at the expense of the wild fisheries. Our federal government is passing out aquaculture grant money like a drunken sailor on a Sunday night. And everyone in the academic world is grabbing at this money and saying how great aquaculture is so they can get another grant. They're not going to bite the hand that feeds them and say, oh, there are downsides, there are issues that go along with aquaculture, but no one really wants to talk about those. kind of being swept under the rug at this point. The 2021 value of the wild shellfish harvest was $25 million, as Marissa pointed out. And DMR wants to replace this with a farm product that's worth $10 million. That's the farmed oyster fishery. Wild harvesters can enter the clam digging, shellfish harvesting industry for less than $1,000 and get paid for their catch today, while oyster aquaculturists need to spend several thousand, if not $10,000, to get their equipment and their seed, and then they need to grow it for 3 years before they're able to make a harvest and get a paycheck. So it makes no sense to me that you would try to promote a fishery that it takes 3 years to get a return when you have an existing fishery that you can have people working today and get a paycheck today. If the money that was invested in aquaculture was invested in shellfish research, it probably would be worth a lot more money than the 25 million. Under the municipal shellfish program, there are over 70 municipalities that have adopted and enforced their local ordinances. And there are only 3 shellfish biologists and 1 program supervisor to manage the municipal program and this shellfish resource along 3,000 miles of coastline. That's a massive lack of capacity at the state level, with only 4 people to manage the second most fishery in the state. The municipal shellfish program is critical to the sustainability of this industry. Commercial landings data shows that towns that have active shellfish programs have actually increased and improved the sustainability and resilience to climate change of their harvests. This is most likely due to conservation measures like flat rotation, reseeding, population surveys, and predator protection. I live between 2 towns that are under state management and no conservation practices are employed. In the spring, harvesters come and they rototill the flats until there's nothing left. This is not management. There are no efforts to provide a sustainable resource, no plans, no conservation, and no clams either. Social and environmental conditions vary along this long coastline as well, which was recognized by the legislature when they created the municipal shellfish program decades ago. Municipalities have the capacity to be flexible, react quickly to issues, and think outside the box. Today, DMR is making cookie cutter policies that ease their burden, but reduce the ability of the municipality to effectively manage their resource. Until recently, municipalities could enforce their ordinance within the municipal boundary, the town line, the city limits, which included the subtitle zone. DMR convinced the legislature to limit this authority to the area between the high water mark and the low water mark to promote aquaculture at the expense of the wild fishery. The ability for municipal management of the subtidal resources has been stripped away. Municipalities can no longer protect and conserve large soft-shell clams that live in the subtidal zone, which are the breeding stock that repopulates the flats. This law change severely limits sustainability. Another issue we have is complacency amongst DMR staff. Some people have held their positions too long, becoming career fishery managers and creating their own little kingdoms. Guaranteed job security leads to stagnation, an inflated ego, and resistance to change. They can simply wait for a new regime to take over, like the governor, and then continue to advance their own personal agendas. Middle managers can also block information from reaching a higher authority. With emerging issues like climate change, we need managers that are visionaries and creative. It is difficult for a town to start a commercial river herring harvest. As Mike said, it takes 10 years of acceptable data to even be considered for an opening. A few years ago, fishery representatives approached DMR staff with alternative management methods that it would allow for a limited harvest in a shorter amount or a shorter time frame. This proposal was blocked by a low-level manager, but when it finally got through to the commissioner, it was seen as a win-win and ultimately led to new federal rules that allowed for a pilot program to explore this management theory. And the commissioner is not, he has some blame in this either as well, having been in office for 11 years now. The commissioner seems to be happy to throw fishermen under the bus and limit their abilities to do their jobs, but he doesn't seem to be too interested in taking on the federal regulators at that level, which is really making it difficult for Maine fishermen to continue to work. Maine used to have a shrimp trawl survey that was conducted for almost 40 years. And in the last couple of years, the commissioner couldn't even get permission from the federal regulatory body, the ASMFC, to do a scientific research survey. And to me, that pretty much shows how ineffective our commissioner is. Now, the ASMFC is made up of 15 states that border the Atlantic Ocean. So if there were true parity in quotas and everyone plays nice and gets along, everyone would have 6.66% of the quota. 6.66 times 15 is pretty close to 100%. In Maine, the menhaden fishery is a small-scale fishery, and we get 0.52% of the total allowable catch, or the total quota. Nowhere near the 6.66% that would be equal with, put everybody on an equal footing. Our commissioner should be at the federal level demanding that we get more quota for these fishermen now that climate change has moved more fish of these menhaden into our area. But instead, the commissioner and the department got the legislature to adopt rules that make it incredibly difficult to enter the fishery. You need to land 25,000 pounds of fish in the previous year to be eligible to get a license for the next year. This year, the commercial menhaden fishery lasted 2 days. The fish haven't even reached down East Maine, where many of the younger fishermen have bought tens of thousands of dollars worth of equipment to enter this fishery, and they're not even getting a chance to try and catch their 25,000 pound quota. Now, we did just get permission for what's called an episodic event fishery, which allows Maine to have another 1% of the total allowable catch. But if 0.5% was caught in 2 days, then 1% certainly isn't going to last very long, and the fish still haven't gotten to eastern Maine. So the commissioner could be doing a lot better job to support the fishermen in down East Maine by confronting people at the ASMFC and trying to get more rules made or more quota for the down East people. So I think that's pretty much all I have to say. I wish that co-management worked better. We have a really good working relationship with a lot of groups. I've worked with Manomet before, and I work quite a lot with the Maine Center for Coastal Fisheries with the LWIFE program. And the state doesn't have all the answers. They don't have the capacity to investigate what might be answers. And that's where citizen science comes in and the whole co-management thing. But as I said, it takes two to dance. And DMR just really doesn't want to hand over any of their power. So thank you for allowing me to share my thoughts with you. And I hope you have a good day. And we'll take questions if there are any.
Anyone have questions for Bailey? Yeah, go ahead. And I'm sorry you guys can't, who are on Zoom, can't see the room. I wish you could see the room, but you just get to look at me, so sorry.
Hi there. I've asked a couple questions. I'll continue to ask a couple more. I guess my first question is for Bailey, but I'd be curious to how the other panelists might respond to the question. And it is that there are a lot of factors that need to be considered in the co-management of these fisheries and the ability to access and benefit from them. So how do you incentivize, or how do you convince these other bodies to want to participate in co-management of these fisheries?
Bailey, you want to go first?
Not really. I haven't found the answer. A big stick, maybe that's the best method we've had to, I've been trying to come up with alternative management theories for the alewife harvest for years, and was basically shown the door until I got several nonprofits involved, a university professor that's one of the smartest guys in Maine about the biological life of an alewife. And it took a bunch of people to sit down with DMR and discuss this. And as I said, we were blocked on the first attempt. And, we had to keep pounding on the door, and people using their connections, social connections, whatever it took to get this message around the guy that was really blocking the issue. And as I said, when the commissioner found out about it, he said, this is a win-win, and we really need a win. And, said, make this happen. This has to happen. And within like 4 or 5 months, it went through the federal level. So it's just getting to the right person sometimes is the key. But how does your average citizen get there? It's not easy. You need to, that's why we formed the 3-town alewife committee, is because we can swim together or sink together. So we, by supporting each other, we have a much stronger voice.
Yeah, I would agree with Bailey. And I think specifically in this case, I think, like I said earlier, in that it was almost co-management because it had to be. This is an instance where, again, the state really has no capacity to be able to collect some of this data, and under real pressure from such a data poor environment. And the same thing with shellfish, only with river herring, you've got an ASMFC that's sort of above that, really expecting some sort of data to be collected at the state level. And with zero capacity, there's almost has to be some sort of acknowledgement for that data to be collected. And then I guess I would also agree with Bailey on the piece where I think his bringing along all these NGOs that have been part of this and connecting with researchers and other folks, unfortunately, is kind of a necessary thing to give some kind of legitimacy to some of these local efforts and show that that they're really of value. And it's almost a peer pressure kind of system where unless there's a necessity for them to have to be able to show some of these things that can only come from this level, and a real pressure from respected kind of peers and that environment, it doesn't usually happen too often. And the only other piece I can see is change from within, some of the systematic change. A lot of times, like Bailey said, it can be one person blocking information, but it can be the other way around too, where one good staff change, one person that really believes this on the inside of an agency, I think can do as much or more good as one individual can do negative. But it's a great question.
Yeah, I think the only thing I would add to that, all of that is, I think the state is limited in capacity, and they, can't or won't engage in some of these ways. And the fishermen are raising their voices about these issues and continually just not being heard in a lot of instances. And so I think the way that I look at it, or at least from my organization standpoint, and I know a lot of the organizations that we work with, is like, if we can add our voice to their voice and try to get that message across and do the research that's needed or whatever it is that's needed to try to move towards that type of change, then I think that's where we see our role in these sort of emergent networks.
Other questions in the room for Bailey or for anyone? I have a question for all of you. Bailey, you sort of touched on this, sort of talking about how municipalities can really react quickly and think outside the box. But at the same time, kind of the climate change and other pressures that these fisheries are facing at kind of a global or regional level. So I'm wondering if you can reflect a little bit about sort of with these global regional pressures, what is the role of this very local level co-management as a governance system? Is it still important, or is it losing its sort of value as these global pressures are?
Sure, great question. And it comes back to it takes two to dance. In 2012 or prior to 2012, Penobscot was harvesting anywhere between 150 and 200,000 pounds of soft shell clams annually. And in 2012, the waters really warmed and we were hit with a massive green crab invasion. And within a year, they wiped out our entire resource, which is yet to recover. And today, you really can't even go out and dig half a bushel of clams in a tide. We have no clams. The destruction was that complete. So we approached DMR and warned them about what we had seen happen. And DMR said it's impossible for green crabs to have done that. It had to be neoplasia or ocean acidification. So we went and we tested clams that we could find for neoplasia, and it took an hour to dig 40 clams of any size to get a sample big enough to be tested for neoplasia. We tested for ocean acidification. Everything was fine. And a year later, DMR decides, hey, you know what? Green crabs eat clams. Well, we told them that. So we had come up with multiple ideas of what can we do, because towns have the ability to think outside the box. We're fishermen, highly creative. We know how to skirt rules and laws pretty well. And our best theory was to get a gigantic net, like a beach seine, because we could sit there in our boat on an outgoing tide, and as the water gets shallow, you could see hundreds of thousands of these green crabs leaving in groups, just this massive wall, a biomass of green crabs retreating back into the subtidal. So our thought was, let's get this giant net, string it up, and the green crabs will run into that net and be caught, and at low tide, we can shovel them all into a boat, into a barge, and crates, chip them, whatever we need to do to kill these things. And DMR was afraid that we might catch an Atlantic salmon or a sturgeon. And if you knew the environmental or the geophysical location of Penobscot, you probably would wet yourself laughing so hard. The odds of a sturgeon or an Atlantic salmon being up where our clam flats are is just absolutely ridiculous. There probably hasn't been an Atlantic salmon here in 1,000 years. This is just not the habitat for Atlantic salmon. But the state's alternative, their solution, was for us to transplant hard clams or quahog from Brunswick, Maine, down in that neck of the woods, because the shells are thicker and the green crabs wouldn't eat them. And we thought about it and said, okay, that's a great idea. Let's try it. And we thought about it some more and said, you know, that species doesn't exist here, and there's probably a reason. Who are we to introduce a non-native species into this river system? So we opted not to do the quahog transplant. And a year later, we find out that the quahogs out of Brunswick were infested with a shellfish disease. So we dodged a big bullet, because we would have transported that disease most likely into the river that I live on, which is not what we would ever want to do. But we had the ability to think outside the box. We came up with multiple ideas on how to attack the green crab infestation, and the state just really wasn't willing to work with us on that. And we offered to pay Marine Patrol to come watch us and biologists to come assist with this netting operation to make sure that we didn't catch, that our bycatch was, there was no bycatch. So that's the end of that story.
Thanks. Marissa or Mike, do either of you want to address that question?
Yeah, I guess just following off what Bailey was saying, I think that's just a great example of how, the problem, like climate change, might be a global issue, but it's playing out differently from one town to the next. And so the impacts are really, diverse. Where Bailey is, like he was saying, they don't have hard shell clams. And in the southern part of the state, as green crabs have wiped out soft shell clams, the harvesters have been able to pivot to harvesting quahogs or hard shell clams. And so the strategies that they're taking are different than what would be taken in Eastern Maine. And so I think ultimately the ability to have that finer scale flexibility in the solutions that you're coming up with to try to combat whatever issue you're dealing with is really important, particularly given the rapid rate of change that's being experienced. But as Bailey also pointed out, like it takes two to tango. And so they can keep coming up with all of these great ideas, but there has to be, the state entity at the table that is also willing to, work with these harvesters and try to test out some of these solutions.
I don't have anything else to add except that I think, there's a solutions piece, but there's also, I think, a local need in that capacity at that level and that local knowledge that's really going to show us just what is climate change and what those things are that we, sometimes it is as a, coastwide, whatever it is, situation that we need to deal with. I don't think, or at least when we see it at that scale, it's usually too late. And it's at the smaller scale that we're going to see things a lot finer, and understand that they're not just one or the other kind of solutions, that there really needs to be a place for a really flexible way of looking at this question.
So we have about 15 minutes. I realize there are some folks online, so if you have questions, please feel free to unmute or pop them in the chat. If there are any other questions in the room, and if there aren't, I'd also be curious to hear from others about co-management structures that might exist in the fisheries that you're involved in. I don't know if in the clam fishery in Nova Scotia, not to ask you to come up again and speak, but if there are any other examples that sort of might reflect some of the similar challenges or successes that these folks have shared, that would also be really great to hear. I guess I'm wondering sort of whether the co-management models that exist in the river herring and the shellfish fishery, which are both fairly unique in kind of where they take place, kind of within towns, if those structures that make co-management work or not work in those fisheries are sort of transferable to other fisheries that maybe exist at slightly different scales, or what kind of lessons can be applied from these really local fisheries to others that might be currently managed at a state level or co-managed kind of in different ways.
Yeah, to me, that's a really tricky one, because I think, and I think I mentioned this, to me, it's really almost can be problematic trying to look at co-management from a kind of a recipe standpoint, and that, this sort of thing is working here. And a lot of times, even if you have a similar life history or things like that, it really isn't a cookie cutter thing, and it's kind of more fundamentally about the trust in the relationship and the problem solving process rather than a formal structure. But I do think I always think it's really interesting looking at the different and maybe this is something we could kick around, and Bailey, having some experience of both, would have something to weigh in on, is I think these are good examples of two co-managed fisheries, one with the state more in the lead, in at least with the Shellfish Advisory Committee that's really aims to be that local knowledge input, and the river herring or alewife fishery that doesn't have that. And then I think hopefully that's what we're trying to create really with the river herring network, and it's more of a grassroots effort to create that local input, looking at those two in comparison and seeing whether one has benefits over the other. I think some of those some fundamental things on how you bring the more local voice into the conversation is important. But I think there are some fundamental pieces that have to be part of successful co-management, and those are really, I think, the simple things like really the trust and the view from all the sides of being on an equal playing field, and to Bailey's point, taking the egos and the power dynamics out of the conversation.
Go ahead, Bailey.
Yeah, one thing I'd like to add is while it's not officially recognized, the Maine lobster industry is basically co-managed. The state is broken into zones, I think A through F. So it's more of a community, local, coastal group that I won't say manages, but makes recommendations for management within their local area. And they can control sort of the licensing numbers, trap limits, how many people have to leave the industry before a new license is granted. Nothing happens in the lobster industry without those lobster councils agreeing to it until you get to federal law, like with the whale issues. And Monhegan actually has its own exclusive zone to fish in, and their own trap limits and their own special little world, which is much like the municipal shellfish program. And this also translates to the scallop fishery, because most lobstermen are also, most scallop fishermen are also lobstermen. And while it isn't organized by geographic area, what they did come up with, because the resource was pretty much depleted, was a scheme where they have rotational closures of areas for 2 years to allow the resource to bounce back. And then they harvest on the 3rd year. And there's always this switching of areas of where you can fish along the coast of Maine. And fishermen from one end of the state to the other can go wherever they want to fish, as long as it's been opened. And that was really brought about due to the input of local fishermen. Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, I think that the scallop fishery is a really interesting example. We heard a little bit earlier today. I don't know if any of you were able to tune in about sort of how it's managed at the federal level too, which is different. I see that Kane has a question in the chat about whether you see some communities doing co-management better than others. And if so, could you say something about the characteristics of the communities that are doing it better or those that aren't doing so well with co-management?
I guess from my standpoint, I see the communities that are tapping into other resources and making relationships with university professors and with other nonprofits around to really, I think as soon as that happens, you see these really natural connections with the formation of research questions or just alignments in a lot of these objectives. And it's a pretty natural fit a lot of times between scientists and these local folks that have that local knowledge and these questions about what's going on right in their communities. And I think it feels like the communities that make that connection and start teaming up with those folks, again, like I said before, kind of, I think, bring themselves some unfortunately needed legitimacy, but also just horsepower for the work that they want to get done. And I think, Bailey is a perfect example of someone who's been able to, really activate a lot of these NGOs around him and universities. And I think it's translated into work, even though, he points out a lot of shortcomings. A lot of, I mean, there's state and federal policy changes that have happened because of that kind of work. And I think it has to do with some of those relationships.
Yeah, and I guess I might add to that, that you sort of pointed to this, but from what I've seen, it seems like co-management works better in places where there is a local champion like Bailey. You do so much work in both of these fisheries, and other towns that have someone that is really actively engaged in pushing this co-management process forward. That's sometimes I think what it takes too.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think having that local person who is really going to push these issues forward, because not all towns have that. And then I also would add, I mean, there is a reality of very varying capacities among these different municipalities. And so, as an example, I sit on the Georgetown Shellfish Committee. We're a very small island community, and we have a shellfish conservation budget of like $2,300 a year to put into any type of conservation activity. And just a few towns over, in the town of Brunswick, they have like tens of thousands of dollars to put into shellfish conservation. They have a full-time warden. They have, so just to say that there's varying sort of scales of capacity. And I think that also translates to how much capacity there is for these local folks to be able to engage in the co-management process and be able to have sort of that same, type of impact in terms of conservation or stock enhancement or what have you.
Bailey, do you want to speak at all to that question?
No, I'll pass on this one, thanks.
Well, we're pretty close to time, so I don't know if any of the three of you have any sort of closing thoughts you want to leave people with before we end.
I'll just say again that I think, with the amount of issues that this industry and beyond the shellfish industry that many of these industries are facing, I really feel like having this local input and local control over fisheries management and at least the ability for this local knowledge to be put to use is just incredibly important. Because I think that, that's the scale at which a lot of these issues are going to have to be dealt with, despite the fact that, a lot of the issues are global in nature. So I think that whatever we can do to try to figure out how to make this co-management system work and improve upon it is really worthwhile.
Yeah, I can't do a whole lot better than that. And I would just say, I think a lot of the things, even though, I think we really struggle a lot with, at least, kind of from my angle is, you get these folks like Bailey and the others that are willing to be part of this. And there's, I think burnout in that scenario is really real. And I think that it's worthy of looking at that social piece of this and what, brings someone like this to the table and how do we keep it from, stopping so that, or keep it going and keep it from, folks like this leaving, just trying, because really it's amazing how much work goes into this with folks that aren't being paid extra to engage in this policy work. That's really complicated. And I think just the more we can work on that and look at different levels, because there's not often going to be someone that's willing to spend this much time. And so a lot of times there's just small pieces, whether they're looking at how we run public meetings and things like that, and creating an environment for different levels of that kind of input's really important. But I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Bailey, anything from you, or are you?
Yeah, I guess I would just say that if it wasn't for the assistance from nonprofit organizations, co-management probably wouldn't get anywhere, because your local harvester doesn't have the scientific knowledge or the resource to information to really battle with the state or federal governments with things. But the nonprofits are more plugged into other nonprofits that can get this information, and that makes all the difference in the world.
Thanks. Well, thank you all so much for presenting and joining from afar, and thanks everyone for being here. Really appreciate everyone's time and attention. So thank you guys.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.